Hi, and thanks for joining us for the Q&A podcast. I'm your host, Peter Slett. This week, we talk with Christina Swarns, who serves as Executive Director of the Innocence Project, which, since its founding in 1992, is responsible for getting hundreds of wrongfully convicted people in the U.S. out of prison. Our conversation with Christina Swarns will begin in a moment.
So how was he convicted in the first place?
Same way most people are. Bad ID. It's more common than you think. Once that mighty ball of justice gets rolling, it's hard to stop.
How's it going, gentlemen? Hey, D.A. Baxter.
Good to see you. How are you?
Good.
Kim was telling me about what happened to Mr. Bryant. I want you to know we're here to help. Anything you guys need.
Thank you. We appreciate that.
I worked a couple wrongful conviction cases when I was in private practice pro bono. I loved it. Probably the most exhilarating cases I've ever tried.
I bet.
Yeah, it's got to be an amazing feeling getting someone exonerated.
I wouldn't know. I was 0 for 2. The only 2 trials I've ever lost.
And that was a recent episode of Law and Order on NBC entitled Inconvenient Truth. Christina Swarns is the Executive Director of the Innocence Project. Tony Goldwyn, the new DA, is a member of your board.
He is, and we are lucky to have him. Tony is a truly passionate advocate for the issue of wrongful conviction in this country. He's been on our board for about 10 years, and he does what he can where he is to advance this issue and bring more public attention and public education to wrongful convictions in this country.
What's the impact of having Law and Order do a segment on wrongful convictions?
You know, Law and Order is one of the most watched television series in history or something like that. And so to have that many eyes, in the world on this issue of how people get brought into the system wrongly and how difficult it truly is to get folks who have been wrongly convicted exonerated is extremely important for us, because we really need people to understand the reality and depth of the problem and to sort of lean in with us and join us in the effort to prevent it from happening going forward.
Well, let's start at the beginning. What is the Innocence Project?
So the Innocence Project is a not-for-profit organization. We are founded in Manhattan. It was founded in 1992 by Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld. I will add that, in 1992, the Innocence Project was founded. In 1993, I graduated from law school. So my entire career sort of, happened doing criminal defense work alongside the Innocence Project. So at that time, when the organization was founded, people didn't really recognize or appreciate broadly that there were people being wrongfully convicted of crimes at all. And so Barry and Peter kind of made a bet, essentially, right? They realized the power of DNA, and they thought that if DNA can be used to convict people, they made a big bet and said, I think we can probably also use DNA to free people. Barry, Peter, and I all started our careers in the same place at the Legal Aid Society as public defenders in New York City. They were in the Bronx. I started in Manhattan. And all of us, during our time in those courtrooms, saw innocent people being wrongfully convicted and struggled, right, to get folks who we knew were wrongfully convicted out of it. And so they launched sort of on this hypothesis that DNA could change the system. And what started as just a small clinic, right, in a law school with just, 2 lawyers and students has grown over the last 32 years into a 115-person organization that has freed or exonerated over 250 people, that has changed 200 laws to make it less likely that these injustices occur. And so, that's been the arc of the organization.
What's the connection to the Benjamin Cardozo Law School?
Yeah, that's where it all began. So when Barry and Peter in 1992, started to embark on this project, they created a clinic at the Benjamin and Cardozo Law School, which is a part of Yeshiva University here in New York. And so, they were working with students. They sort of put out a call saying, hey, we're interested in cases of people who think they've been wrongfully convicted that might have biological evidence in them. Write to us. And they and the students together went through thousands and thousands of letters looking for cases where they thought that there was biological evidence that could exonerate folks. And together with the students, they began, one by one, finding people, testing DNA, and exonerating them. And so the Cardozo School of Law is the place it all started. It's our home base.
Are Peter and Barry still active with the
yes.
Innocence Project?
100%. First of all, they started this thing. And so there's no one that knows more about these issues than they do. So they are special counsel and obviously co-founders of the Innocence Project. They work with us in many, many different ways. They are constantly strategizing and consulting with our lawyers on cases. They work with me and the development team, going out and meeting with donors and, other supporters of the organization. They are one of our most effective spokespeople, right, around public education. They do presentations at conferences and trainings. They are a critical part of the organization still today.
Christina Swarns, is the Innocence Project international, and do you have state chapters?
Great question. So the Innocence Project that I work for, that Barry and Peter founded, is one not-for-profit organization. Again, we have about 115 people on our staff, and we are the headquarters for the Innocence Network. And that is a collection of over 70 other independent innocence organizations that are also committed to sort of advancing the ball around wrongful convictions and correcting, getting people free, changing the law, and making the system better. Each one of those organizations around the country, and many people in many states around the country will know, right? There's a New Jersey Innocence Project. There's a Pennsylvania Innocence Project. There's a Florida Innocence Project. Those are all independent of each other with their own boards of directors, their own funding streams, independent of us. My organization, however, hosts a network support unit that provides capacity building support and technical support so that we are able to lift up and elevate and increase the capacity of all of these organizations around the country. And that's because we recognize, there's no way for this one organization to scale up to be big enough to handle the problem of wrongful conviction by itself. That's literally impossible because of the scale of the problem. So it's important for us to have healthy and robust organizations around the country and the world doing this work in partnership. And so we are the headquarters of the network, but all of those organizations are independent of one another and of us.
So when the Los Angeles Innocence Project took up the Scott Peterson appeal, that is not something that you are working on.
That's correct. I know as much about that as you do, right? I read it in the news, so I can't speak about that at all.
Are you international?
So the network is international. We have folks in various countries around the world and, more coming on every day. It's interesting because, each of these other countries has their own forms of government and legal systems. So, the work of freeing innocent people abroad sort of has to be customized to the various different legal structures that exist. So, but yes, absolutely. There was also recently a conference in Europe for the other organizations abroad. There's now coming on a European registry of exonerations, so sort of cataloging the exonerations that are happening abroad. But yeah, so there is definitely a growing presence, around the world.
How are you funded?
Great question also. So we are funded by a variety of sources. Our biggest contributors are individuals from around the country and around the world. We are incredibly fortunate to have a lot of people who are really passionate about our work and have, partnered with us over the years to make sure that we can get as many innocent people freed or exonerated as we can. So the largest bucket of supporters that we have are individuals. That's followed second by foundations, right? We also have an amazing group of foundation supporters that are partnering with us in this work. And after individuals and foundations, then it is we have a gala every year, of course, that raises a significant amount of money. as well as corporations partner with us in various ways. And last but not least, we have the law school also provides some financial support to us.
So what would be the process if somebody wanted your help?
Yeah. So we get 2,000 requests for representation every year. And so what happens is, we get these letters into the office, and you think that these are people largely incarcerated across the world. These are handwritten letters of individuals who, many of whom have been in prison for decades. And so we have an intake department that reads and responds to every single letter that we receive. So they review the request for representation. If you can tell from that first letter, right, that they have to say that they're innocent, right? There's some sort of baseline requirements, right? The person has to say that they're innocent. Historically, our organization is focused on DNA as the basis of exoneration. So we have that team looks and says, okay, if you can see from the information that's been provided in a letter, can you tell, if this was a sexual assault? Obviously, you think, okay, that's probably got some biological evidence. If it is not, right, you have to try to ascertain whether there's biological evidence that could be where DNA could be extracted. Often that requires the intake team to send back a questionnaire to the person who is requesting representation to kind of get the detailed information that we need to figure out whether this is someone we think we can get exonerated with DNA evidence. Once the questionnaire comes in, we actually have a group of law firms that partner with us to analyze all of the case evidence. We get a questionnaire. We then have another intake staffer who goes and collects all of the records on the case, all the transcripts, all the lab reports, all the expert reports, right? We get sort of as full of a case file as we can. And once all that information is collected, we have a handful of large law firms that work with us to review that information and make a determination. Again, is this person saying they're innocent? Because as you might imagine, we have, for example, people reaching out to us that say, I'm innocent because I acted in self-defense. That is true, right? That does make you innocent. It's just not the work that we do, right? We are looking for people who had no involvement of any kind, right, in the offense for which they have been convicted. Other people write to us and they'll say, I'm innocent because I was not the shooter, right? I didn't even know there was going to be a shooting. I thought I was participating in a robbery. Also true, right? That may make you innocent. It's just not a case for this organization. So there's a screening out of those folks, and we refer them to other organizations that we think can help them on the basis of the claims that they've presented to us. But the remainder, we then say, is there biological evidence? Is the biological evidence available, or has it been destroyed? Do we think that if we test that biological evidence, do we think we can exonerate you on the basis of, right, a finding from that test? If all of that comes back, yes, the intake team has a meeting with the post-conviction litigation team, which is the exonerating lawyer team, and they come to agreement. Yes, this is a case we want to take. And then it goes over into the lawyers, and the lawyers handle it from there. They file motions in court asking for the right to test DNA. To test DNA, to re-examine a case, right? They're negotiating with prosecutors. And, one step, one day at a time, they go through the process of testing. You get an exculpatory result, and then you get an exoneration in the ideal world. Yeah.
Christina Swarns, do you charge your clients?
Never. Absolutely not. We do not charge anyone for our representation. We're a nonprofit organization. We represent people overwhelmingly who do not have access to resources otherwise. And we recognize that so many people in jails and prisons across this country, are indigent. And our mission and our goal is to free the innocent. And so we would not put a monetary restriction or a barrier of a retainer or a fee in front of that. No, we are 100% free to those we represent.
Can you give us a sense of the average amount of time between receiving that handwritten letter to potential exoneration?
It ranges, right? I have to tell you that we get so many requests for representation. We have quite a waiting list, a queue of people that are, trying to get in our front door. So it really depends, right? How receptive is the district attorney's office to our phone call, right? I always think that if a prosecutor is confident in the conviction, they should have no problem if the Innocence Project shows up and says, listen, we know there's biological evidence. We see it wasn't tested. We will pay for the testing. We just want to see what we find, right? There's no real reason for them to oppose, in my view. Unfortunately, that is not the case in many instances. In many instances, we have offices that oppose us, even though there's literally no cost to them and very little burden on them other than providing the case evidence to us or our experts. And so if we get into a situation where you have a prosecutor's office opposing, right, we're then now, litigating in court, asking the judge for rulings, and that can take years. Another thing that can make the process take a really long time is that, again, in 1992, when we all first started this work, people, the law enforcement agencies weren't prioritizing the preservation of evidence in the ways it needs to be preserved to, for years later, extract DNA, right? And so often, evidence was lost, evidence was destroyed, evidence was not maintained in a way that allowed, it was maintained in a way that allowed the biological material to degrade. So a lot of time is often spent trying to find the evidence, right? Is it there? Once they find that it's missing, tracking it down. So there's a lot of time often spent sort of just in the process of, getting to testing, right? And that is incredibly variable depending on, again, the evidence, the state of the evidence, and the receptivity of the DA's office. So there are cases that we've been able to move through, in 5 to 7 years, and then there are cases that have taken much longer.
Well, one of your active cases, according to your website, is Forrest Johnson, who has spent 25 years on death row based on an ear witness. Can you tell us anything about that case?
One of the things that's remarkable about Mr. Forrest's case is the consensus around the need for his conviction to be overturned. The jurors there are jurors in this case, prosecutors, and of course our organization as well as his lawyers who have come together and recognize that this is a situation where this individual. There is an evidence to support his conviction. And so that's kind of one of the examples of cases that I would have flagged to say, sometimes we get resistance in circumstances that are confusing to all of us. And we think in those cases, right, when you have such clear question of innocence and consensus around it, right, this is not a situation where people, where Mr. Forrest Johnson or anyone else should be continued to be held on death row or any place else. And so, yeah, that's exactly the kind of situation where we're all left scratching our heads.
And another case, Malcolm Alexander, 38 years in prison.
Yeah, in Angola, Louisiana State Penitentiary. Mr. Malcolm Alexander was a really just, a tragic case. An individual, a woman, was a victim of a sexual assault that took place in a store. She never saw the assailant. The person was behind her at all times and had a gun to her head from behind. And nonetheless, Mr. Alexander wound up getting charged, convicted, and, sent to prison for this crime. Even though, again, there was just no way for the victim to identify the perpetrator. Once again, through DNA evidence, we were able to establish years, decades later, Malcolm's innocence. But these are the kinds of tragedies that have taken place over the years, sort of as DNA and the use of DNA evidence sort of penetrated the legal system.
Christina Swarns, do you think that the prosecutors believe in their cases when they bring them? And how often do they help you in the exoneration process?
I do. I think the vast majority, of prosecutors are, well-intentioned, hardworking individuals who truly believe that, they are bringing justice on behalf of a legitimate victim of a very serious crime. There are, of course, outliers. Individuals who know at the outset that they are not pursuing the right person and sort of pursue them anyway. but those I do think are outliers. So most prosecutors, I think, are well-intentioned when they go into a case and when they pursue a case, even if they ultimately get it wrong. One of the things that's happened over the last 32 years, right, when the Innocence Project started practicing, prosecutors' offices were not at all engaged in sort of the uncovering of wrongful convictions. But as that time passed, and now over 3,000 people have been exonerated in this country, prosecutor offices have recognized that as, their role is to seek justice, and they've sort of joined the effort in many places in creating conviction integrity units or conviction review units, which are departments within a DA's office, which is actually assigned to re-examine that office's own convictions to determine and confirm, right, their accuracy. Not all offices have them. Not all the offices that have them do it right. But for those that have a chief prosecutor who puts his or her weight behind it, who properly and fully staff the office, who properly and fully resource the office, who follow best practices, the outcomes can be robust and significant. And we have seen many prosecutor offices around the country build and engage those kinds of offices, and that has significantly contributed to the number of exonerations in the country. And yeah, we partner with a lot of those conviction integrity units and conviction review units to work together on a joint reinvestigation of a case of concern. All right, to hand in hand, look at the evidence together, re-interview witnesses together, and together come to a finding about whether or not the person in question, we believe the person in question is innocent. And when we agree, right, it's wonderful to go into court on a joint application with the prosecutor's office to vacate a conviction. But yeah, we have definitely done that in many instances.
According to the Prison Policy Organization, there are 1.9 million men and women incarcerated in the United States currently. In 1,566 state prisons, 98 federal prisons, 1,323 juvenile facilities, 142 immigration detention facilities, 80 Indian County jails, and they've gone through thousands of legal systems.
Right.
What's the estimate for erroneous incarceration?
Yeah, the estimates are that about 5% of the prison population in the country, the folks are innocent. So we're looking at over, 100,000 people or so who are currently behind prison walls, even though they did not do anything wrong, right? They're as innocent as you or I, and that number is, shocking and horrifying. It is traumatizing, obviously, to be wrongfully convicted, but, that trauma is compounded by, of course, what we know about our prison system, which is violent, which is dangerous, which is, you receive inadequate medical care. So the trauma compounds, right? You first get wrongly arrested, then wrongly convicted, then wrongly incarcerated, and 100,000 people, and 3,000 already exonerated. So it is an enormous problem in this country. And that's why I say to you, folks who'd ask, there's no way for this one organization to scale up to a size that is appropriate to handle the issue, right? We have to have partnerships at other Innocence Projects and prosecutor offices across the country to meet this challenge.
It is better 100 guilty persons should escape than that one innocent person should suffer. Benjamin Franklin.
That's right. Yeah, that is one of the cornerstones of our legal system. It's what I learned, and everyone that has been through law school learns in this country, right? That the goal and the object of our legal system is to be able to accurately sort and discern between the guilty and the innocent. And we now know that we have a problem doing that, which is why, right, the Innocence Project is dedicated not just to freeing and exonerating people, but also to changing the way the law is structured and the way the law is practiced to reduce the risk of innocent people coming into the legal system in the first place, right? We want to make sure that we're learning from the lessons of the innocents and their cases, and correcting, right, the processes and practices that we're engaged in so that those injustices do not recur. And this organization and its policy department has been instrumental in changing, over 200 laws and policies to reduce the risk of wrongful conviction.
Christina Swarns, has the Innocence Project ever gotten it wrong?
Has the Innocence Project ever gotten it wrong? No.
Pursued a case where it turned out the person was guilty?
No, our office has focused on DNA, right? It's science, right? It either is, we test, right? The biological evidence is tested, and the DNA your DNA is either on the item of evidence or it's not. All right. And if the question is, do we have people that ask us for representation that we test, and sometimes it comes back inculpatory? That does happen in a small minority of the cases that folks that have come to us, right? And so then, right, that case just, we don't move, we let people know and we move away from it. But once the DNA proves someone innocent, right, it is what it is. The science tells the story.
Well, according to the Innocence Project, wrongful convictions have been based on eyewitness misidentification, misapplication of forensic science, false confessions, official misconduct, coerced pleas, and inadequate defense. If we could walk through a couple of those, beginning with eyewitness misidentification.
Yeah. So, the majority of the DNA exonerations that we have had here at the Innocence Project, and again, we have freed or exonerated over 250 people, has involved mistaken eyewitness identification. All of us sort of grew up, certainly speaking for myself, grew up in a legal system that understood and expected that when people are victims of crime, right, we all think to ourselves, I know what I'm going to do when I'm in that circumstance. I'm going to focus. I think this, right? I'm going to focus on the person and the face. Are there tattoos? Are there, whatever, scars? You're right. From watching TV and the movies, right? You think to yourself, I'm going to focus on all these things so that when the police come and they ask me who did it, I can provide a really, robust and detailed description. But over the time, right, over this 30 some odd year period, the DNA has shown us, right, that people get it wrong all the time, right? In so many, the majority of our cases, eyewitnesses went into court and went to police departments and went to prosecutors' offices and said, I know who did it. This is the person who did it. I saw them. I'm identifying them. I am certain. Enter DNA, right? And the science tells you that they're wrong. And so that sort of caused this organization and others to embark on the question about how and why are people getting it wrong, and how are we as a legal system able to sort of reduce the risk that wrongful identification is going to judges and juries and causing people to be wrongfully convicted. And so we have advocated for things like allowing experts to testify in criminal trials to explain to fact finders, juries, and judges, right, that indeed what happens if, for example, you or I are facing someone holding a gun, although we may say to ourselves, I'm going to focus on the face, the reality is that what we're going to focus on is that gun, right? Because that is the thing that is most at risk for us. So we're not going to prioritize focusing on the face. The eyes are going to go to a gun, right? And so juries should know that. Judges who are making guilt and innocence decisions should know that. And so we have really worked hard to bring education and also to change the policies and practices of police departments. For example, we also know that, if I am in a photo array and then I am in a lineup after the photo array, right, and I'm the only person that recurs in those two circumstances, right, the person that's observing it the second time is going to be like, if you pick me up the first time and then you see me again, is going to realize, right, there's a reason I keep showing up, right? And that sort of validates and confirms, right, what may be an erroneous call in the first place, but the more I show up in sort of these serial identification procedures, it sort of confirms in their head, right, this identification. And so we have also urged sort of changes in police protocols, including, for example, having the person that administers an identification procedure blinded, meaning not know who of the people in the photo array or the lineup are the actual suspect, so that they cannot influence the witness. Having, for example, photos shown one after the other instead of in array, 6 people in a row, Because if you look at 6 people in a row, what the mind will do is say, which of these 6 people looks closest to the person in my head? And so you just make sort of a relative judgment. That number 3 looks closest to the memory I have in my head. If, on the other hand, if you're shown photos, one photo, yes or no, no, and then another photo, yes or no, no, you're making individual judgments against the memory in your head, right? And so we have urged these kinds of reforms. So that's eyewitness identification. The second most significant cause of wrongful conviction, is the use of unvalidated forensic science. So many of our cases have involved the introduction of evidence that is just inaccurate and unreliable. For example, bite mark evidence, right? We all remember from the Ted Bundy death penalty case that, there was expert testimony that there were bite marks on the decedent that were conclusively tied, to Ted Bundy's, bite pattern. The reality that we have learned over the years is that you can't really, that's not an accurate science. It's not a science at all. Studies have been done that brought together, forensic odontologists, right? Dentists, forensic dentists, and they'll say, okay, here's a set of teeth, here's a bruise or a mark. Doctors 1 through 10, you tell me, is this a match? And what they have found is you can't get the same answer every time, right? You never get consistency, right? One time they'll say yes, the next group will say no, right? And that's sort of a hallmark of science, right? Replicability, accuracy, and that doesn't exist, unfortunately, in the field of bite mark evidence. And so that's an example of sort of the kind of pseudoscientific evidence that's often presented in cases. But of course, juries don't know this, right? You have someone who presents as an expert who, has all of the trappings of expertise and knowledge that we as civilians don't have, that goes into a courtroom and talks about this, this sort of seeming clarity about, a conclusive determination of that this bruise is caused by this individual, and juries accept it, even though there is no true scientific validity to the that kind of identification. So yeah, 52% of our cases have involved unvalidated forensic science like bite mark evidence. Another third of our cases have involved false confessions. That's another one that I think people always have trouble wrapping their heads around, because all of us will say, right, I would never, right? I'm saying it to you now, I would never confess to a crime I didn't commit. But what we know, again, right, the DNA really told the story, because it's science. It is what it is. Either the person did it or they didn't do it. Their DNA, is dispositive. And so we had all these cases where people confessed to committing a crime, but when the DNA entered the story and tested the evidence, it showed that they actually did not commit the crime. We're talking about, single perpetrator sexual assault cases, right? Person confesses, but either the sperm is or is not theirs, right? It's a very simple question. The DNA says it's not theirs, which means that these are false confessions, which really was, something that the system had to think about, right? Accept as a reality over the last 30 years and grapple with and understand, right? Why are people confessing to crimes that they didn't commit? How and why? And what we've learned, right, is that there are categories of people who are more susceptible to wrongful convictions, right? Younger people are more susceptible. No surprise there, right? We tell our kids, right, you got to tell the police the truth or do what they say, right? Younger people who have intellectual disabilities are more susceptible, right? People who have been under the influence of drugs and alcohol are more susceptible to false confessions. And then you have sort of the circumstances of the interview that makes someone more likely to give a false confession, right? The longer the interview is, the more coercive the police officers engaging in the interview are. These are factors that are going to increase the likelihood of securing a wrongful confession. So, for example, we have a client, a young man who was 16 years old in the Bronx. His name is Hugh Burton. He came home from school. He was a high school student. He came home, 16 years old, and found that his mother was murdered. He was picked up by the police, brought in for questioning, and this young man asked for a family member to come in. The police refused to let them come in. and the police told Hugh if he just confessed, he would be allowed to go home. So, of course, he did what they told him to do. And he made a false confession. And that sent him to prison for, I think, over 20 years. And it wasn't until, decades later, the Innocence Project, some folks in New Jersey at Rutgers, all came together to reevaluate this case with the Bronx DA's Office Conviction Review Unit. And together we were able to establish that confession was false, right? And the police officers that took the confession from him also took false confessions from two other people, right, prior to that one, right? And then they overlooked the true likely suspect for this murder. So yeah, false confession is a very real phenomenon that occurs that we see in our cases, and it is a tragedy. And then we have informants as well, right? Informant testimony, people who get compensated for offering inculpatory statements about our clients, as well as, the other issues that you flagged, right? Obviously, if you have poor counsel that doesn't have the resources to investigate the case, doesn't have the training to handle the case, more likely to get a wrongful conviction. Government misconduct is huge in these issues. We have, unfortunately, police and prosecutors who go outside the lines and go outside the bounds and withhold evidence of innocence, withhold witnesses that could present exculpatory testimony. And because of that, folks wind up getting convicted of crimes that they didn't commit.
Christina Swarns, is there ever compensation for those who are exonerated?
Yeah, that was one of our institutional priorities as well, and our policy team, making sure that every single person who is subjected to the trauma of wrongful conviction would be compensated. These are, again, individuals like you and me who today who've not committed a crime, right? Who have not done anything right now, I can say, since 120 and or so, you and I have been together. So I don't think either of us have been out committing crimes. But if we got arrested today and hauled off to jail and charged and convicted with a crime that occurred during this time period and then spent decades in prison, we should be compensated for that injustice, right? Because that is something that we are not responsible for. They didn't cause, right? This is an error of the state or local government, right, that allowed this to occur. So it is and right, during that time, not only you're subjected to trauma, you're denied the opportunity, right, to work, to support your family, there's family trauma associated with this. So it is an absolute imperative. And really, right, for the legitimacy of the system, it has to account for its own mistakes. And so it's an absolute priority that people who are subjected to wrongful conviction are compensated. Now, today, almost all of the states in the country, but not all, compensate the wrongfully convicted. States like, for example, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania still does not provide compensation. But in many instances, we're still working to make sure that the compensation that is provided is sufficient to meet people's needs. Often, again, people spend the bulk of their high income earning years, right, behind prison walls. And so by the time they're coming home at 50 and 60 years old, their opportunity to earn money and to earn a living and support their family is significantly reduced. And to make it worse, right, they haven't paid into Social Security. So, right, they're not available. That's not available to them either. So it's really important, right, that we have systems that fill that gap and give people the opportunity to rebuild their lives and, start fresh, notwithstanding the trauma that they have endured.
Now, we spoke a little bit earlier about Malcolm Alexander, the longest-serving Innocence Project exoneration, 38 years in Louisiana prison. What's his attitude today? Do you stay in touch with him?
Yes, of course. Yeah, Malcolm has been a member of the Innocence Project Exoneree Advisory Council, which is a group of folks that we have represented that advise us and consult with us on institutional priorities and help us to guide the work. And Malcolm was a participant in the Exoneree Advisory Council. He is a very hardworking and, he's actually got a great sense of humor. Malcolm and so many other of our freed and exonerated clients, people always ask me, they say, like, what are they like? I would expect, right, anger, right? For folks to be incredibly angry about the experiences that they've been through. And some people are, obviously, and everyone, all of them are to some extent. But what Malcolm and others on the EAC and other exonerees that we work with have, sort of taught us, right, is that, frankly, to endure 38 years, to endure 20 years, to endure, 15 years, 25 years behind the wall, right? The anger isn't helpful, right? You kind of have to let it go and, sort of think about the future in different ways. And so Malcolm, like so many of our other clients, is, an amazing, family member. He's an amazing supporter of our organization, and he is living life to the fullest.
The Innocence Project was founded in 1992. In that last 30 plus years, technology has changed drastically. Cell phones, cameras, AI. Has that aided you? Has it aided the prosecution? How's it impacted your work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm going to start, though, where you left off. So one of the things that we see so often, again, people are doing 30, 20 years behind the walls. When they come home, that's one of the first challenges that our freed and exonerated clients face. We have a social work department that helps every single person that is coming home from prison reintegrate into community. Because, again, you've done decades behind the wall, and all of a sudden you're immersed into this world full of technology that you have never seen, never had the opportunity to interface with. The world has changed. Everything is now on a computer. And so one of the big priorities of our social work team, right, is to acquaint our freed and exonerated clients with, right, we give them, make sure that they are set up with cell phones and laptops and teach them, how to use it. And again, right, when you're behind prison, you don't have a cell phone given to you. So this is a whole new world for many folks who are coming home that have to adjust to this new sort of prevalence of technology. I have a colleague here that's Rodney Roberts, who is our reentry coach. He is exonerated. He did about 20 years in New Jersey, and now he works with us to help folks who are coming home from prison to return to community. And he talks about how when he first came home, he was confused walking outside and seeing, it seemed like everyone was talking to themselves, he said, right? It seemed like everyone was just walking down the street talking to themselves because they all had AirPods in their ears. And so it took him a while to realize what was happening. But yeah, so that's just another element of your question about sort of the change in the use and the prevalence of technology. In terms of the work, we are now really closely monitoring the use of sort of emerging technology in law enforcement because we're really concerned about how and when that technology, the accuracy, I should say, of that technology and how the risk that technology can ensnare an innocent person. One of the lessons, right, of this last 30 years is, right, like bite mark evidence and so many other sorts of sort of pseudo scientific evidence, right, unless we are ensuring that we are rigorously testing and validating and ensuring the accuracy of the technology that we are relying on in the criminal legal system. Unless we do that, we are guaranteed to continue to have wrongful convictions. So we have watched with some alarm as law enforcement agencies have sort of, quickly embraced technology, understandably, right? Embraced technology that seems to make life incredibly easier, right? We're talking about facial recognition software, gunshot detection software. These are technologies that are used now routinely in law enforcement agencies across the country. Understandably, right? You think like this facial recognition software will make their lives much easier, right? You can quickly identify someone who was captured on a Ring camera, right? You can see someone catches a video of a perpetrator on a Ring camera, and then you throw it into the facial recognition software, and, ba-boom, look, you got yourself your suspect. And that would be great if we were certain of the accuracy and reliability of the facial recognition software, which unfortunately we are not. And so what we have seen over the last couple of years, is that sort of, for example, right, facial recognition software has been proven to be substantially less accurate for the faces of people of color, right? It just isn't as able to accurately discern between them. And so we've seen a handful, 8 or 9 people who have been wrongly arrested on the basis of facial recognition technology that got it wrong. And every single one of those people were Black. So we're very concerned about the use of the sort of the indiscriminate, I should say, use of this kind of technology, this facial recognition technology. We also worry about sort of whose faces are in these databases that are used, right? Are all of us in it, right? Is it literally driver's licenses, right? Are we just allowing law enforcement to search, right, the facial profile of every person that gets a driver's license? Or should there be some controls over access to those kinds of images? What happens if they're using mugshot databases? Should people who were exonerated, should their faces be in there? Probably not, right? Are people whose cases were dismissed, should they be in there? Probably not. But these kinds of controls have not thus far been put on the use of this technology. And what we know is, based on this sort of recent handful or this recent cluster of cases, that people are being brought into the system who are innocent. And so we're really concerned about sort of the over-reliance on this leap to embrace technology without learning sort of the lessons of the past and sort of making sure that the technology that we rely on has the rigor, the accuracy, the validity to ensure that it is reliable and it can appropriately make the judgment that we're asking it to make. Same story with the shot spotter is a sort of a kind of technology that brands itself as saying if a gunshot is heard out in the city, right? It can tell the police department that it took place and where it took place, and it can send, law enforcement to a particular location where a gunshot was fired. That's the premise. Unfortunately, right, the accuracy of that software in terms of, is it a gunshot or is it a backfire from a car? Is it a firecracker, right? The software has to be accurate in its ability to do what it's saying it does. And right now, there are real questions about the validity of those determinations, both around facial recognition and ShotSpotter kind of technology. And so we as an institution are incredibly concerned about this leap to embrace new technology without learning the lessons of the past and first ensuring rigor, accuracy, and validity.
Christina Swarns, as executive director, are you still involved in cases?
Yeah, I am not litigating any cases personally. I am, however, constantly consulting with my extraordinary team of lawyers. We have about 16 folks in the organization that are handling cases in jurisdictions and states around the country. And so I am always delighted when they come in my office and say they want to talk about a case because I missed litigation, and so I get to dabble in it vicariously by consulting with my colleagues on their cases.
What's your background?
So I have done one thing my entire life, which is criminal legal system work. I went to the University of Pennsylvania for law school, and when I graduated, I started my career as a public defender here in New York City, in Manhattan, at 100 Center Street. So I started out just doing the work of representing people who were charged with misdemeanors and felonies. And so I spent a couple of years doing that. I loved it. I loved the chaos and the fun and the pressure of it. But then I really did want to do death penalty work, so I transitioned after a couple of years to the Philadelphia Federal Defender's Capital Habeas Unit and spent 7 years there representing people condemned to death in Pennsylvania. Had an extraordinary time and learned an enormous amount sort of about the death penalty, how it's administered, who it's administered to, looking at and reinvestigating cases from a post-conviction posture, working with experts and all kinds of other issues. So I spent 7 years there working just on death penalty cases. And then I was invited to join the NAACP Legal Defense Fund back here in New York as the head of what was then called the Criminal Justice Project. And so as the head of the Criminal Justice Project, I maintained a docket of death penalty cases, but we also litigated cases about, for example, juvenile life without parole issues. We litigated cases about race and policing in New York City. And so we had sort of a pretty broad docket of issues. I spent 14 years at the Legal Defense Fund, and during that time, I had the honor and privilege of representing a gentleman named Dwayne Buck, who was sentenced to death in Texas in a case that had really, truly extraordinary. It was a death sentence that really relied on truly extraordinary, explicit racist testimony. And so I litigated that for 6 years, taking it to the United States Supreme Court, where I argued the case before the court and was successful, thankfully. So I argued that case in 2016 and won in 2017. And then after that, I moved on from LDF and ran the Office of the Appellate Defender, which is an extraordinary, holistic criminal appeals defense office here in Manhattan. Spent just a couple of years there before I was invited to join the Innocence Project, and I have been here since 2020. So that's my story.
And in 2021, the Innocence Project won an award. Let's see the video.
As a liberty lover, what could be worse than someone's freedom being taken away, for them to be locked up unjustly? And when I think of the Innocence Project, what could be better than restoring those lives? I think there's a wonderful symmetry between people we've honored with previous Freedmen Prizes, people who are risking their lives to fight for liberty, and honoring the Innocence Project, who restores lives, gives people back their life, their liberty.
Freedom means everything. Without freedom, you've got nothing.
Freedom is the totality of life. It's the sum of everything good.
Freedom to me at this point, like I say, it's a new life. It's like being reborn. It's like given a chance to live a life I have been denied.
Christina Swarns, some people might see a disconnect between, pardon me, the Libertarian Cato Institute awarding the Innocence Project the Milton Friedman Award.
You know, there are some people that would say that, but the truth of the matter is it makes perfect sense, because our issue doesn't really live in a particular political, space. No one believes that innocent people should be charged, convicted, and sentenced to prison for crimes they didn't commit, right? That's not a democratic or, capital, politically democratic or Republican or libertarian or conservative issue. It's it's a universal issue. And that's one of the things that is somewhat unique about the Innocence Project, that we do have supporters from across the political spectrum that recognize that truism, right? That no one should be convicted of a crime they did not commit, right? And all of us should aspire to a criminal legal system that is able to accurately make those determinations. And to the extent that our system is not able to do that, all of us should be, number one, concerned about it, and number two, committed to leaning in and figuring out how we get the system to where it needs to be. So we're endlessly grateful to the Cato Institute for recognizing and partnering with us and supporting us. But again, our issue is not one that has a particular ideological bent to it. It is a universal truth that all of us hold.
This is a quote from Christina Swarns in 2021. The knowing perpetuation of a false narrative around one of the most significant events in the 20th century, while two innocent men set wrongfully convicted of the crime and imprisoned, undermines the integrity of the criminal legal system and fosters profound distrust of police and prosecutors. This is the kind of misconduct that drove last year's reckoning for racial justice and demands meaningful accountability and reform. That was on November 23rd, 2021. Ms. Swarns, what are you referring to?
That was the day that the two our clients who were convicted of the assassination of Malcolm X were exonerated. We are proud endlessly of all of the people that we represent and have had the privilege of working with, and have, and continue to partner with on this work. But Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam, what they endured, right, having been wrongfully convicted, and then, right, having spent their entire lives, branded with one of the most notorious, crimes in American history, was an enormous. It's beyond my comprehension, the weight that they carried, right, beyond simply, right, the already profound and horrifying weight of a wrongful conviction to be branded, right, with this this remarkable weight of having to be labeled, right, as this person who killed a notorious icon for many, is beyond my comprehension. That is a case where the Innocence Project worked incredibly closely with the Manhattan DA's office Conviction Integrity Unit, and together, again, and I'm sorry, the Law Office of David Cheney's, and all of us together sort of went back through the records in this case, those that had been disclosed originally and those that were not, and ultimately were able to demonstrate that, let me just take a moment and go back, which is to say that at the original trials in the late 1960s, another gentleman took the witness stand and said that he was the person that was the shooter and that he committed the crime with two other people he refused to name. The jury rejected that information. But what we know is that the law enforcement actually had evidence that corroborated his statement and corroborated his assertion that he was the shooter and these other two people, not Mr. Islam or Mr. Aziz, who were our clients, had committed this crime. But that information was withheld. And so what together we were able to establish with the Manhattan DA's office was that there was evidence all these years, right, that these men had not committed this crime, and that evidence remained buried until 2021. And we all came together to present it to court, to tell the world, right, that these men, as they had always said, were innocent, and give them the opportunity to live. One of them passed actually before he even was exonerated, but give the remaining gentleman his opportunity to live and stand, to stand with his head held high, right, in the knowledge that he had been vindicated and the truth of what he was saying all these years was established and recognized.
And we're run out of time, so we're not going to be able to show the video, but we have video of John Grisham talking about the Innocence Project and his work with the Innocence Project as well. Christina,
John is an amazing board member, and we're lucky to have him. Absolutely.
Christina Swarns, once again, 16 years is the average amount of time that somebody spends in prison before they're exonerated. How many cases are currently active by the Innocence Project?
We have any given time, we have about 200 cases on our docket. So we've got 200 people, we're working to get home right now.
The website is innocenceproject.org. Christina Swarns is the executive director. Thanks for spending an hour with us.
Thank you.
And thanks for listening to this week's Q&A podcast produced by C-SPAN. If you like this podcast, tell your friends, rate and review us, and follow us on social media. @BookTV is our handle. You'll get more updates and schedule information there as well.